Essentially, what we are going to be talking about is a couple of things, primarily having to do with cartels, how cartels are relatively unstable in the market conditions, and what kind of actions by the government can make them more stable and more durable. So, cartels in the market and by the governments. So this is one of the topics that we already covered to some degree. Discussed cartels last time. I'm just now going to remind you of some of the main points pertaining to cartels and their instability, to revise or maybe reiterate some of the pieces of information and theoretical analysis pertaining to the cartels, and then we're going to delve a little bit into the problem of how modern governments sometimes, in the name of stability, in the name of public interest, very often end up supporting cartels, sometimes even creating. So one of the assumptions that we had to accept at some point here was that the cartels are genuinely unstable in a free market. So the cartels in which multiple firms try to conspire together to raise prices and reduce production are unlikely to succeed in a free market for a variety of reasons. We mentioned some of these reasons already, some of them multiple times. I'm going to just review the basic evidence, the basic reasons, or theoretical reasons why it is not expected that a cartel in a free market would succeed. So the first reason is that in the absence of governmental barriers to entry, if the entry into the business is free, outside competition will undermine cartel. So what cartels do, they raise prices and reduce production. This is an effect of increasing prices for the consumers. High prices are an invitation for other firms to join the market. So why are high prices of a product an invitation, quote unquote, for other firms to enter the market?
They can make it cheaper.
Exactly. If they can make it cheaper, then they can take over the market. So remember the basic supply curve we discussed, and we said if the price is low here at $10, or price per bushel of wheat is $10. This is the quantity of wheat that will be sold. If three of us form a cartel and say we're not going to sell it below $15, what's going to happen? The price will increase. Let's say that we are the only suppliers, the only farmers in this county. So the fact that we were the only farmers selling wheat tells you that we were the only ones who were capable of producing wheat at a cost lower than $10 and selling it on the market. You'd sell something at $10 only if your minimum selling price is lower than $10. If your costs that determine your minimum selling price are lower than $10. If we say we're not gonna sell it at less than $15, what happens then? Those people who could not have competed against us before, whose costs were higher than $10, now can enter the market. And do what? Undercut us. We charge 15. People whose cost of production are $12, they can sell at 12. Consumers will buy from them, or him, or her, not from us. What can we do to counter this? If we cannot imprison or kill or chase away this intruder, we have to match the price that he is asking for. That means the breakdown of the cartel. Cartel cannot succeed if we cannot maintain artificially high prices with impunity. In this particular case, we cannot do it. So the less efficient firms then will enter the market and undercut the cartel members, charging lower prices, take over the market share. Why would they take over the market? Because consumers love lower prices rather than higher prices. That's one thing. Imagine that you were selling, let's take another example, butter. You are selling butter because it's easier for me to demonstrate another point that I want to make. So then butter producers of butter who could not compete against us at the price $10 per 5 pounds or whatever, now can compete if we charge $15. What else can undermine our cartel? So the firms that didn't exist, potential competitor, enter the market now and compete against us because our prices are high enough so as to invite them simply to join the party. Is there anything else that can happen on the competitive side, the side of other firms, that can undermine our position? Who else may enter the market now, apart, to help you, to guide you a little bit in your thinking here? Who else can enter the market apart of other producers of butter? No, forget about the government, just competitors, other firms. Government is out of the picture. Government doesn't intervene. Now we're analyzing what happens with the cartel if there's no government interference whatsoever. Who else can enter, theoretically?
A firm that has like a substitute for that product.
Yeah, exactly. So depending on the elasticity of demand for our product, the producers of margarine, for example, can enter the market. So then one of the factors that undermines every monopoly, including the cartel, which is a kind of joint monopoly created by multiple business firms, is the substitution effect. So you know this has to do with the demand, this basic principle that if a price of one substitute increases, the demand for the other substitute will increase. So if a price of butter increases for whatever reason, let's say because our cartel increased the price, the demand for the closest substitutes will increase. So there are two ways in which competition may, in the absence of governmental action, can undermine a cartel. First, by the producers of the same product in the same line of business entering the market because of higher prices, allowing them to produce more at higher cost and sell on the market, undercutting by their slightly lower prices than ours, our competitive position. And the second way in which cartels are undermined is by the increased incentives for the substitutes. Right? Now, what will determine the efficiency of this substitution effect as a check on cartel's power? It will be determined by the elasticity of demand for our product. So if demand for our product is very inelastic, that means, what does that mean? That means that we can charge very high prices, we will lose very few consumers. That means that there are no good substitutes, there are no close substitutes for our product. So then this substitution effect check will not be probably efficient or enough. So more vertical demand curve, more inelastic the demand is, less substitutes you have. So ideally you would want to form a cartel. If you want to form a cartel in a market economy, in a field where the demand elasticity for your product is very low, the inelasticity of demand is very high. Demand is very inelastic. So that's one of the problems First, these two mechanisms that can keep a check on cartel behavior. The second problem is how to divide up the shares. Division of spoils. That's quote unquote dividing up the market. So what cartels do, they say we're not going to sell more than 10,000 units, 10,000 pounds of butter. Now, who is going to sell how much? Let's assume that we make an agreement. I'm going to sell 4.2. William Fedderson is going to sell 3.5. William Blewett is going to sell 5.3, and we then start producing and selling. And now, who is going to enforce our behavior to check if we sold more or less than that? It's kind of expensive. Larger the cartel, higher the cost of maintaining and enforcing this agreement about the division of the market. So every one of us will have an incentive to increase production more than our assigned quota. And larger the number of the firms in the market, higher the costs of enforcement of this agreement. Human nature being what it is, eventually every one of us would want to undermine this originally agreed upon market share. So that leads us to the third problem, which is kind of connected to this division of spoils, cheating. This is one of the forms of cheating. The usual way, what cheating means in the context of cartel, it means that you do something to dishonor your obligations that you have towards your fellow cartel members, to increase your production or to lower the price. Typically, lowering the price is a main threat for the stability of the cartel. Why would anyone have an incentive to lower the price? Take over the customers from your friends. You assume that your partners are going to be suckers who's going to stick to the letter of the agreement while you are reducing prices and harvesting their consumers, your market share, increasing your profit that way. Lower prices, higher demand. Lower prices, higher quantity demanded. The basic law of supply and demand. The basic law of demand, pardon me, in this particular case. So you increase your revenue and your profit as well. So everyone has now this is a kind of game theoretical models. You know, the game theory is a mathematical framework sometimes applied in economics that studies how people behave in the expectation that the other guy is going or is not going to do something. So you're not just making decisions about yourself, you're taking into account what your strategic partner or your enemy or your friend is going to do or is not going to do. So now you know you want to honor the agreement. You don't want to break the agreement, let's say so. But you know that all other guys can cheat and that you have an effective way of preventing them from cheating. Then you're going to cheat even if you don't want, even if you are kind of in good faith accepted the agreement. You have to cheat. That's your dominant strategy, as game theorists say. The best way to behave for you is to cheat because you cannot prevent them from doing so. So sometimes a situation is weird in some context of economic cooperation that the most effective way to behave is to be irrational. In a certain sense, to be irrational. So this is one of those situations in which strategic context is such as to make cheating the dominant strategy the best possible for everyone. So that's another reason why cartels cannot be stable, because there are no effective ways of preventing cheating. Everybody is motivated to cheat, and everybody knows that everybody else can cheat. That's a perfect storm. And that's the main reason. If I were to quantify the relative significance of all this, this is by far the most important one. In American history, especially in the 19th century, we had many examples of unsuccessful cartels in all kinds of oil, railroads, all kinds of business. They failed miserably, all of them. Unless the government stepped in to protect them. And we'll see in a moment how governments can do that and do that. Before that, just one more reason why. Maria, please.
Yeah, so our cartels, like, they don't seem to be fundamentally bad or good, but the thing is, because it sounds like, as like the consumer, the cartels have a high price and they're not willing to lower it. That might be unrealistic for the consumer. But also, it seems like if there's something that needs to be protected, like what good comes out of this for the consumer?
So you're asking, is there any beneficial role that cartels can play?
Right.
Yeah, not that I know. So no, but you have to take into account one more thing here. Maybe the most precise answer to that question would be that cartels are not particularly pernicious or problematic, but that they are not particularly dangerous either. If left to their own devices, depending on the circumstances, sometimes it might be different, but they're usually not terribly effective. Remember what we said? I said once already before. One of the preconditions, one of the reasons for the instability of this agreement is that nobody can enforce cartel agreements. That's the common law proposition that goes back centuries. So if that's the case, then it's mostly a waste of time. After a while, people will give up on cartels. So there are specific circumstances have to be present. And you shouldn't take it black or white. There could be some circumstances in which cartels could be more durable, but that's very likely going to require governmental help. So sometimes even government help is not enough. We'll see this fourth reason. We'll tell you more about this. The fourth reason is that price competition is not the only form of competition. So non-price competition. So even if you have a governmental cartel, it ain't going to be stable. It ain't going to work. If there is a significant opportunity for the cartel members to cheat in a different way by differentiating product. So it's easy to form a cartel where we are selling butter or oil or wheat or corn, like a fungible goods which are mutually substitutable, which are equally serviceable. Any unit of butter is equally good as any other unit of butter. Where the product is homogeneous, just like in our perfect competition model. Remember that. Everybody is selling the same thing. If the product is such, then the only way for you to cheat on a cartel agreement is to offer lower prices. If you have a reliable way of keeping that in check, you can tell. So it shouldn't shock you, for example, that what is the most non-price competition? What is the most successful cartel in the history of the 20th century? Don't tell me Colombian cartels, because that's not what I have in mind here. OPEC. Anyone heard about OPEC? What does that mean? The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and countries, fine countries like that. Iraq. So, how come? Why are they successful? They usually set a quota. We're not gonna you probably hear from time to time that they have their meetings and they say we're going to increase production by 3% because the price is too low. High, they adjust their, if price is too high, then they reduce production to keep the price enough for them to have profit. What is the secret? The secret is that oil is a fungible good. Iranian oil is pretty much the same as Iraqi oil, as the Russian oil. It's similar product. But imagine if they came together and tried to make a global cartel of automobile firms, automobile cartel. Imagine if General Motors and Toyota and BMW formed a cartel and said, we are not going to sell a car of certain class below $35,000. Can that cartel succeed, do you think? As compared to an oil cartel. Why yes or why not?
Other people can make cheaper cars than that.
No, let's say that they're the only producers. Imagine a world in which only BMW, Toyota, and GM are the only brands, and everybody else is prohibited from entering the market. Imagine you have some nasty, evil world government that abolishes everything else, all other car companies, and just these three remain.
Maybe a lot of people can afford that.
And they sell at the same price. And you have an effective mechanism for preventing anyone from selling at a lower price than $35,000 for a specific car, for a higher class, $55,000. Class of the same.
People would probably stop buying cars. If you can't afford it, yeah.
Okay, let's say that people can afford it. We're a wealthy society, otherwise people like cars very much. Inelastic demand curve for cars, people like to buy cars. There are no good substitutes for cars, so we are stuck with them. Can cartels succeed? What is different as compared to the situation with oil or butter or wheat? You know this commercial. I think I watched it when I was in Europe 10 years ago. Like a guy is trying to explain to his girlfriend why he didn't show up for a date or something. I said, I had a problem with the car or something. She said, you're lying. Toyota doesn't brake. But she's a Toyota driver. That's Toyota. Compare that, say with the GM. I think that Japanese cars are slightly better cars than American cars. And BMW is a class on its own. How many people would buy a GM car worth $35,000 as compared to BMW worth $35,000? You see, this is non-price competition with quality. You can increase quality, and for the same price, you can just increase your market share. You can destroy the cartel. No division of the market will be sustainable anymore. So you can compete by quality as well. And cartels are likely to succeed, or more likely to succeed, only if the non-price competition is negligible or impossible. And that's the reason why the only successful cartels, even if aided by the government, are in the fields like agriculture or oil production. Not car production, not entertainment, not any line of production in which you can differentiate your product by higher quality. Okay. Any questions? Now enters the government. So how government can stabilize the cartels? Simply by erecting legal barriers to entry. Legal barriers to entry. You cannot enter into this business at all, or you can under the unfavorable conditions. So I'll give you one example what this could mean potentially. In Europe, you have regulations, consumer protection regulations, that say no genetically modified crops could be sold in the European Union. You know what is the economic essence of this? It's a simple legal barrier to entry for American farmers. So they want to keep the prices of agricultural concerns in Europe higher. Genetically modified crops made by American farmers are cheaper than the European products. So they simply prevent the Americans from entering into the market by enacting this type of like health-based or health-inspired, consumer protection-inspired regulations. That's a legal barrier to entry. Although there is zero evidence that genetically modified organisms have any adverse health effects. Even the European universities and academies of science made multiple studies showing essentially no connection to any kind of health problems. Yet, the lobbyists can push through these trade restrictions that essentially work as the safeguards of the domestic agricultural cartels. Now the European farmers can increase their prices more because they are protected against the foreign competition, which is cheap. There are also other regulations like the price floors that help maintain position of, if you have a few firms that compete in the market. Price floors actually, if you cannot sell the product on the market at a given price, the government will pay the difference. Guaranteed price guarantees. You produce. So you have a very weird situations in Europe that the farmers, sometimes the government doesn't pay how much they expect. They would spill milk or wine sometimes, just like a blasphemy. I mean, both of this in France, because the government won't pay them the price supports increases in revenue. And the most common one, the most common form of successful cartel enforced by the government are trade unions. So what they do? Why trade unions could be treated as cartels in a certain sense? Imagine we have a private firm. Trade unions negotiate collectively for higher wages. They get higher wages and they make a contract with the employer that the non-union members cannot get a job. You're excluding competition by the law, and you're securing for yourself higher wages. So at the beginning of the 20th century, actually, these kinds of collective agreement type of deals were considered to be anti-competitive. Antitrust law was brought to bear on this, applied. Agreement. Remember the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first article says, all agreements in restraint of trade are illegal per se. So union negotiation for higher wages involving restrictions to the entrance of other non-unionized members is an agreement in restraint of trade. It's an anti-competitive. It's essentially a cartel of union members who exclude other non-union members from participating. And in America, actually, a piece of legislation was passed entrenching this type of relationship during the New Deal in 1930s, called Wagner Act. It essentially said if 51% of the employees of a given private firm decide by secret ballot to be the union members, then everybody in the firm has to be the union member. They will have to pay the union dues. That was the law, and still the law. However, something changed in the last 20 years or so. Many states across the nation started passing. And by the way, one more thing that they got Wagner Act. The first provision was this closed shop, closed shop type of relationship. That means non-union members need not apply here. Everybody who wants to work is a union member. And the second was they had the right to prevent the strike breakers, scabs as we call them, for using force. Now this changed after the Second World War to some degree. And in many states, the basic remedy for this type of legislation, for this type of problem inherited, was the so-called right to work legislation. It's simply legislation that abolishes the closed shop. It says you don't need 51%. You cannot impose the union membership on people who don't want to be the union members. So remember, I used to work when I was in Serbia as a teacher, as a professor at public school. And as soon as you sign up, as soon as you are hired, you automatically become a union member. And I hated the unions, and I didn't want to be the union member. And I asked to be exempt. I said, no, the law is clear. You have to be. So that kind of regime existed in many private firms in America. In the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, that was the golden age of private sector unions in America. Ever since 1960s and especially 70s, the union membership, the percentage of private sector workers in America who were unionized started declining dramatically. So there are two reasons for this, like this almost disappearance of the union cartels. One was the right to work legislation, many states passed, which weakened the influence of the unions. So now you have the right to work states and non-right to work states in America. So you can do some research if you're interested in that. I think North Dakota is the right to work state, if I'm not mistaken. I know that Wisconsin is, Texas is, many other states are. So that played a role as well. But there was another reason why the private sector union membership declined dramatically, and that was a change in the structure of the American economy in the last 40 years, 50 years. It means this transition from the standard Fordist manufacturing-based economy to this modern post-industrial economy. So I'll give you just one example to illustrate you what I mean by this. American manufacturing produces like 2 or 3 times more goods and services than 40 years ago. The rate of growth of productivity in American manufacturing of all kinds, automobile, steel, aluminum, everything, increases at a higher rate than GDP. That means that the general increase in economic performance of the economy, the manufacturing performs better than the rest of the economy. So all kind of scare stories about the demise of American manufacturing and how American manufacturing is done and so on are false. American manufacturing is doing great. The problem is that American manufacturing is producing much more with far fewer people. So they were the base manufacturing workers, were the power base of the traditional trade unions. And with the changes in modern production processes, now we have the automation and robotization, so on, much more prevalent. Simply we produce much more stuff with far fewer people, far fewer opportunities for unionization. So remember, this is for me very kind of characteristic experience. A few years ago, I was driving from Atlanta, Georgia to Alabama. There is one area near the West Point. There's this boundary between Alabama and Georgia. It's just like as far as I can see, just the factories, factory after factory. It looks like this automobile factory or something. And I asked my friend, "What is this?" He says, "There's just Toyota, Mazda, Subaru factories." He says very few people work there. They're heavily robotized, and they're doing great. Automobile manufacturing in America is doing great, much better in the South. So Georgia, Alabama, and southern states are the home of many European producers: Mercedes, Daimler-Benz, BMW, Toyota, Subaru, and so on. They're doing much better than Detroit, who has all kinds of help, the government, and so on, and powerful unions, by the way. Still. So see, that's just one example of gradual decline in the union membership. To some degree, is just a consequence of a gradual decline of the share of manufacturing workers who used to be the main power base, the main membership base for the traditional unions. It's much more difficult to organize people in the services industries, the small firms. So you know, the significance of small and medium-sized enterprises in America dramatically increased in the last 40 years. And there is not much room to organize unions if you have 5 or 6 or 7 co-workers here and you know some of these people. It's far less likely that you're going to form a union in such a firm than in a gigantic concern in which thousands of people work. But this concentration of people who work in the same place declined. This density of employment, if I can use that term, the density of workers per firm declined. So that decreased the likelihood of creating the modern union. When you add to that the right to work legislation in many states, the private sector union membership declined precipitously over the last 40 years. But something different happened in the same time, that the public sector union membership increased by almost exponentially from 1970s onwards. Teachers unions primarily, but also police unions, and firefighters, and many others. So that's a separate topic. We don't have time to go into great detail about the public sector unions. Maybe we can just touch on it in the spirit of the elections that have just finished. It seems like we will have a change in the government in Washington, D.C. And when it comes to unions, there was one person in the Trump administration who was particularly criticized and by the unions for some of the reforms that she was proposing and trying to push through. You know who that person was? Who was the most hated and criticized cabinet member of Trump administration by the unions, especially by the teachers unions? Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. So what was her proposal? What was her main policy? Something that threatened the cartel of public sector unions, teachers unions. So teachers unions are run and financed by the government. Whatever happens to performance, there is not a very strong competition with public sector unions, because you can send your children to private schools, but you have to pay twice. You have to pay the taxes for the public sector school, and you have to pay the private school in addition to that. So only wealthy people can afford that. So it's very nice that Barack Obama's daughters in Washington, D.C. have got to very nice private schools, but some single mother from Detroit, Michigan, or from Philadelphia is not very likely to afford such kind of thing. So now a school choice comes along here. What is the school choice? That's a very simple idea that every parent in every community will get a voucher. The voucher entitles you to a certain amount of money to be spent exclusively for the education, for the tuition. For education, you can go to a public school, to one public school, to another public school, to private school, to Catholic school, any school that you choose. And for that person, some schools are chartered, which means allowed by the government to perform the service of education. They could be even private schools, and they can work, they can accept the vouchers from the parents. Now, a much stronger competition will develop right now. And especially the poor people will be the main beneficiaries because they cannot afford to pay additional money to send their children to fancy private schools. You see, this is the irony, some of the worst performing schools in America are the inner city schools in big cities. And some of the best performing schools are the schools in which the same children from poor neighborhoods, very often heavily African-American children from cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, who go to charter schools, they're performing well above the national average. Why? How? We don't know. There must be something wrong with the public school system then. If the same demographic, essentially, you cannot say that, oh, these are kids from poor neighborhoods who would perform wherever, single parents and so on with broken families and so on. So they're not going to perform well in school. How they can perform then in charter schools? So and that was the fight then. The public said, teachers unions, they don't like this idea because they undermine their position as essentially as a cartel. If your financial position depends on your performance now, and there is a check, there is the outside competition to you. There are those private schools and charter schools. Now you are on the spot. You have to perform, or else. So the tests are clear. Like reading, whatever it is, SAT tests and other objective indicators of the school performance. As far as I read, thus far the indicators are unmistakable. So the same demographic, relatively poor people, mostly poor African-American children from the inner cities, and some white and Latino children as well. But look, 60-70% poor white children from inner city schools. This is the world of difference between their performance in public schools system and in the charter schools. And some of the that's the irony. The two biggest promoters of this idea are two African-American economists, Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. So Google these two guys, they're fearless. Because what is there? This idea is then considered somehow, that was the craziest thing of all, it's considered somehow racist. this kind of school competition, and they had to defend it and to say no. So Walter Williams gave a couple of scholarships to students who go to some of these charter schools, and he spent some time studying the performance of these schools 20-30 years ago. So that's another area. So you see that the cartels can go well beyond the narrow confines of production and exchange and so on. In education, you can have cartels. You can have cartels in healthcare. So you can licensure. It's a cartel, essentially. What is a licensure? It's a governmentally imposed legal barrier to entry for doctors who do not undergo a certain type of licensing procedure. Barbers, licensure for barbers. I cannot do your haircut unless I'm certified by a professional board. It's an expensive process. Not everybody can pass that. So then the group which is within profits from reducing the competition from the outside. So non-licensed, wherever. Plumbers, non-licensed barbers, non-licensed teachers, after all. It's always for the benefit of the insider group that can exclude the competition. Okay, we're almost out of time. Any final questions? So don't open the homework assignment. I will get it done by the later today evening, and I will post the lecture in the meantime. Okay. Yes, I'm going to do it today. Sorry, I forgot. I started doing that immediately before the class. I'm going to post everything. So have a nice weekend all, and see you next week.